Welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we strip away the noise to analyze today's breaking stories. It is Tuesday, February 24th, 2026.
And we are really standing at a convergence point today. Usually, history moves in a straight line. It's a slow, predictable drift. But sometimes, and we're seeing this right now, the tectonic plates shift all at once. Today isn't just a regular news day. It is a fraction point. We aren't looking at one isolated crisis here. We are looking at the simultaneous combustion of three major geopolitical front roads, all of them detonating at the exact same moment.
Yeah, it really does feel like the wheels are just coming off the bus entirely.
Yeah.
I've been looking at the wires all morning, and it's a perfect storm. We have the Middle East teetering on the absolute edge of a regional war, and that's being fueled by some incredibly inflammatory rhetoric about divine right, alongside the very real deployment of F-35s.
Exactly. That's front one. Theology meets high-yield explosives. But then front two is right on our doorstep. Mexico has effectively entered a state of civil war following a decapitation strike on the CJNG cartel. A strike that, as we're going to discuss in this deep dive, had U.S. fingerprints all over it.
Right. And front three. I mean, we really can't forget the date today. Today marks exactly the 4-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And just to mark the occasion, I guess, we have reports of direct British strikes on Russian soil.
It is a trifecta of escalation. You have the Levant, the Rio Grande, and the Donbass all flaring up simultaneously. But here is the game changer that almost no one saw coming. While the executive branch is pushing outward militarily, trying to project power in three different directions, the judicial branch just pulled the rug right out from under them economically.
The Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah, the Supreme Court has issued a ruling that effectively handcuffs the Trump administration's economic warfare strategy. And this is happening right at the precise moment the U.S. dollar is coming under intense siege globally.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have a massive amount of ground to cover for you today. We're going to take you from the streets of Guadalajara to the skies over Tehran and finally into the chambers of the U.S. Supreme Court. But we really have to start with the most volatile situation on the map right now, the Middle East.
The diplomatic firestorm. That's really the only way to describe it.
Right. So this story broke after an interview between Tucker Carlson and the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. Now, Huckabee is known for being a staunch supporter of Israel. That's not new. But what he said in this interview has set off alarm bells from Cairo all the way to Islamabad. I want to be precise here because the language matters. I'm not endorsing this, but we have to look at the exact words.
It wasn't just support. That's the key distinction. It was a theological definition of geopolitical borders. And that changes the rules of engagement entirely.
Exactly. Huckabee didn't just cite international law or, basic security concerns. He cited Genesis 15, literally quoting the Bible to claim that Israel has a title deed to land stretching from, and I quote, the Nile to the Euphrates.
Let's just stop right there and look at a map. Because I don't think people realize the sheer magnitude of what Nile to Euphrates actually means in real terms. It's massive. If you draw a line from the Nile River in Egypt to the Euphrates River in Iraq, you aren't just talking about the West Bank or Gaza. You are talking about swallowing the entire kingdom of Jordan. You are talking about taking Lebanon
and chunks of Syria.
Right, absorbing massive chunks of Syria, about 2/3 of Iraq's populated areas, and crucially, northern Saudi Arabia and parts of Egypt.
It's an imperial claim, and he didn't stop there. When pressed on this in the interview, because obviously that sounds insane in a modern diplomatic context, he explicitly stated it would be fine if Israel took it all. He said, God gave that land to his people. It would be fine if they took it all.
And this is where the theology hits the very hard wall of geopolitical reality. The backlash was instantaneous, and frankly, it should have been expected by anyone at the State Department. You have over 14 nations condemning this statement within hours.
The OIC, right?
Yes, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, the Gulf states, they are all furious. But the most critical reaction comes from two specific countries, Jordan and Saudi Arabia.
Why those two specifically? I mean, aside from the obvious fact that a U.S. ambassador just claimed their sovereign land belongs to someone else, which is usually grounds for war right there.
Because of the logistics of the war, we are currently trying to start with Iran. According to the detailed analysis by Larry Johnson, who understands theater logistics better than almost anyone out there, Jordan and Saudi Arabia are the two nations currently hosting the primary U.S. military assets needed for a strike on Iran.
We have F-35 sitting there right now.
We have F-35 sitting on runways in Jordan and Saudi Arabia right now, yes.
So let me get this straight so we can make this clear for everyone listening. We are parking our most advanced jets on their lawn, preparing to launch a war from their backyard, and simultaneously our ambassador is telling them, by the way, God says this lawn actually belongs to Israel.
It's a humiliation ritual. It puts the leaders of Jordan and Saudi Arabia in an absolutely impossible position. Look at King Abdullah in Jordan. He is sitting on a powder keg. His population is already furious about the situation in Gaza. Now, the U.S. says his entire kingdom is biblically invalid.
Yeah, that's not going to play well domestically.
Not at all. If the Jordanian monarchy or the House of Saud allows the U.S. to launch attacks on Iran from their soil after that statement, they risk a full-blown internal revolution. It destabilizes the very launch pads the U.S. military is relying on.
So while the diplomats are scrambling to clean up that mess, and I imagine the phones at the State Department are completely melting down right now, the military reality is ramping up regardless. We're seeing a massive buildup. We have carrier strike groups, that Abraham Lincoln is in the Arabian Sea, that Gerald Ford is in the Mediterranean.
And those land-based F-35s we just mentioned, it is a classic pincer movement. The idea is to surround Iran from the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me. Despite this massive show of force, literally an armada, the reports coming out of the White House suggest confusion. We have Steve Witkoff, a special envoy to the region, reporting that President Trump is frustrated and curious.
Curious is a very specific and somewhat alarming word to use in a war room.
Right. He's apparently asking, why haven't they capitulated? The assumption in the Oval Office seems to be that the mere presence of this firepower, the sight of the carriers, the threat of the F-35s, would force Iran to just fold. Witkoff says the administration is confused why Iran hasn't come to the table to surrender its nuclear and missile programs yet.
This brings us to what I call the fatality of assumption. There's a deep, dangerous intelligence gap here between what Washington believes Iran can do and what independent analysts say Iran can actually do. The U.S. view, which is echoed by people like General Petraeus, is that U.S. air power is untouchable. The narrative is simply, we fly in, we destroy their defenses, they surrender. It's shock and awe part 2.
But that was 20 years ago in Iraq. The technology has changed completely.
Precisely. Let's look at the counterpoint. Analysts like Scott Ritter and Larry Johnson are arguing that Iran today is not the Iran of 2003 or even the Iran of 2020. They argue that Iran has fundamentally integrated its defense grid with advanced Russian and Chinese technology.
We're talking about the Chinese YC-8B radar, right? I've seen this mentioned in some of the technical briefs we were reviewing.
Yes, the YC-8B anti-stealth radar. Now, we need to explain why this matters to you, the listener, because it completely flips the script. The F-35 is a stealth fighter, meaning it is specifically shaped to deflect X-band radar waves. That's the kind used by traditional targeting systems. But the YC-8B uses UHF and VHF wavelengths, longer waves.
So instead of bouncing off the sharp angles of the plane, these longer waves resonate with the physical structure of the aircraft itself.
Exactly. It detects the tail fins, the fuselage, the wingspan. It might not give you a lock precise enough to hit a dime from 100 miles away, but it tells you exactly where the plane is in the sky. And reports suggest Iran has successfully integrated these sensors with Russian S-300 and S-400 missile systems, plus their own indigenous defense networks.
So the invisible planes are suddenly entirely visible, and then there's the missile inventory itself. The U.S. intel claims Iran has maybe 2,000 ballistic missiles, but the sources we're looking at, Johnson Ritter, they're estimating the numbers actually between 10,000 and 20,000.
That is a staggering difference. If the U.S. estimate is off by a factor of 10, the entire war planning is fundamentally flawed. And there's a logistical problem with the F-35s themselves that practically nobody in the mainstream media is discussing right now. Larry Johnson points this out so clearly. The F-35 has a combat radius of about 600 miles.
Meaning it can fly 600 miles out, execute a strike, and fly 600 miles back.
Correct.
Yep.
Now, do the math. If you take off from Jordan or from a carrier in the Arabian Sea, and your target is a nuclear facility deep inside Iran, say near Natanz or Fordo, you are operating at the absolute limit of that range, often exceeding it.
So they literally can't make the round trip on a single tank of gas.
No. They would absolutely require mid-air refueling. That means big, slow, fat tanker planes. KC-135s or Pegasus tankers flying in wide, predictable circles over Iraq or the Persian Gulf.
Wait a second. If the F-35 relies entirely on stealth to survive, but it has to hook up to a giant, non-stealth, commercial-sized tanker to get home, doesn't that completely defeat the purpose of the stealth jet?
It creates a massive vulnerability. If that new Chinese radar works as advertised, and if those S-400s are fully operational, they don't even have to shoot down the F-35s. They just have to shoot down the tankers. If the tankers go down, the F-35s run out of fuel and drop out of the sky without a single dogfight taking place. The pilots are swimming. The whole capitulation narrative assumes a supremacy that might not actually exist in reality.
That is a terrifying thought, that the entire strategic posture is based on a tech advantage that might have already been neutralized. It reminds me of the reliance on the Enigma machine code in World War II, except this time, we might be the ones whose code is broken. So with that incredible risk on the table, what is the political calculation inside the White House? Because it sounds like not everyone is on board with this strike.
Far from it. We are hearing about significant internal friction. Vice President J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard are reportedly lobbying exceptionally hard against the strike behind closed doors.
Tulsi has always been anti-interventionist, so that tracks. But Vance is interesting here. He's really looking at the domestic angle, isn't he?
He's looking at the polls. They're looking at the exact same data we are. 75% of Americans oppose a new war in the Middle East.
Trump ran his campaign on ending wars. Starting a massive new one, especially one that could go horribly wrong based on bad intel, seems like political suicide.
That's the all-or-nothing dilemma that they are facing right now. L-Team Kurt Curlato. Daniel Davis makes a crucial point here that we need to highlight. He warns that the idea of a limited strike, this idea of just popping a few nuclear facilities and leaving quietly, is a total myth. It's a fantasy cooked up in think tanks.
Because Iran gets a vote.
Iran absolutely gets a vote. If you strike them, they don't just sit there and take it. They respond. And with 20,000 missiles, that response isn't just military, it's economic. They could easily close the Strait of Hormuz,
where 20% of the entire world's oil flows every single day.
Exactly. They could systematically destroy the refinement infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They could target U.S. bases scattered across the region. Gas prices in the U.S. would double or triple overnight.
So the true price of a limited strike is likely an all-out regional war and a severe global depression.
Which would inevitably crash the U.S. economy and likely end the Trump presidency before it even really gets going. So you have Huckabee pushing for biblical conquest, the military primed for an attack based on highly questionable intelligence, and the political wing screaming to pump the brakes because the voters and the economy simply won't survive it. It is absolute chaos.
Speaking of chaos, and speaking of borders that are effectively dissolving as we speak, let's move to the second front of this deep dive, just south of the border. We've been watching Mexico for years, obviously, but what happened this week feels entirely different. It feels final.
It is different. This isn't just cartel violence anymore. This is the breakdown of the state in significant regions. We are witnessing the Somaliification of our southern neighbor.
So let's look at the trigger event. It was the death, or at least the severe incapacitation of El Mencho, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the leader of the CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation cartel.
The most powerful, most violently sophisticated criminal organization in Mexico and arguably the world right now.
We have confirmed reports that he was killed or wounded in a raid by the Mexican army. But this wasn't just a Mexican operation. And this is the part that I want to drill down on because it feels like a massive, unprecedented escalation of U.S. involvement.
It is. Hard data confirms the active presence of the U.S. Task Force Countercartel. This is a new unit stood up recently specifically for this kind of high-value kinetic targeting. But even more significant than that, we have reports that U.S. Navy SEALs, specifically elements of SEAL Team 2, arrived in Mexico on February 15th to actively support this operation.
Hold on, let's emphasize this for you guys listening. U.S. Navy SEALs operating on the ground in Mexico. That is technically an act of war unless they were explicitly invited by the host nation. This is confirmed by the data.
It's not leading the nightly news broadcasts, but the flight logs and the specific intelligence chatter from the region confirm the movement of these Tier 1 assets. And the geopolitical context strongly suggests they were invited. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has been under immense, crushing pressure from the Trump administration.
The message was basically, solve it or we will.
Exactly. Jose Luis Granado Ceja from the Latin America desk at Dropsite News analyzes this as a desperate political move by Sheinbaum. She likely authorized the joint operation, quietly inviting the SEALs in to appease Trump and show she is taking definitive action. It's a return to the kingpin strategy. Cut off the head of the snake and hope the body dies.
Okay, so the head of the snake is gone. El Mencho is out of the picture. But instead of the violence stopping, it completely exploded across the entire country.
That is the Hydra effect. And frankly, any serious cartel analyst could have told you this would happen. When you forcibly remove a central strongman from a sprawling cartel like the CJ&G, you don't end the cartel, you just create a massive power vacuum.
And we are seeing the immediate aftermath of that vacuum today. The numbers are staggering. We have major blockades reported in 20 different states in Mexico.
Think about the scale of that. 20 states. That's a massive portion of the country's landmass. This isn't a local riot in one city. This is a synchronized nationwide insurrection.
We have reports of 250 distinct points of obstruction. Burning buses, burning trucks, banks physically set on fire. We have reports describing Guadalajara, a major modern city, essentially the tech hub of Mexico, as a complete ghost town.
Imagine San Francisco or Austin suddenly shutting down completely because heavily armed militias have set up burning roadblocks on every single major highway. That is the reality in Guadalajara right now.
And for any listeners who might be planning a vacation, Puerto Vallarta is effectively cut off from the world. The airport was heavily barricaded. Tourists are stranded inside their hotels. Patrick Henningsen is reporting from the ground there, and he describes it point blank as the cartels officially declaring war on the Mexican government.
This perfectly highlights the catastrophic failure of two opposing policies simultaneously. The hugs, not bullets policy of the previous Mexican administration failed completely because it let the cartels grow unchecked and build standing armies. But the kingpin strategy, the preferred U.S. approach of violent decapitation, is failing right now because it blindly assumes violence brings order.
When in reality, it just brought total anarchy.
It triggered a massive succession war. It's the Game of Thrones effect. Now you have El Mencho's top lieutenants fighting each other in the streets for the throne. You have the rival Sinaloa cartel moving in to take CJ&G territory while they are internally weak, and you have the state security forces caught directly in the crossfire of this multi-front war.
And what about the blowback for the U.S.? Because we pushed for this.
Immense destabilization. You absolutely cannot have a civil war on your immediate border without severe consequences bleeding over. Trump pressured Mexico for military action. He got his wish. Now the neighbor's house is on fire. You simply can't build a wall high enough to keep out the economic fallout, the inevitable massive refugee waves, and the sheer violence of a civil war right next door.
So we have the Middle East on the brink of a high-tech war that might fail spectacularly, and Mexico in flames from a low-tech war that has already failed. And that brings us to the third front in this deep dive, the one that has been grinding on, chewing up lives for exactly 4 years today, Ukraine.
The grim milestone, February 24th, 2022 to February 24th, 2026.
I mean, let's just look back. 4 years ago, the Western narrative was so incredibly confident. Remember that. Russia would collapse in weeks, the sanctions would absolutely destroy the ruble, the oligarchs would turn on Putin, the Russian people would revolt in the streets, and the Russian military was widely mocked as incompetent.
And today, we have to look strictly at the hard data provided by analysts like Alexander Mershouris and Jeffrey Sachs. The prevailing media narrative of a stalemate is simply false at this point. A stalemate implies both sides are stuck, neither is moving, neither is gaining ground. What we are actually seeing is a slow-motion, systemic collapse of one side.
The data shows Russian forces are growing in size and capability, while Ukrainian forces are rapidly shrinking.
It's a brutal math problem. Russia has more men, significantly more artillery, and an untouched industrial capacity pumping out shells day and night. Ukraine has run out of fighting-age men and is rapidly running out of borrowed Western equipment.
The most telling stat for me, looking at the daily reports, is the electricity grid. Kiev is receiving only 4 hours of electricity per day right now.
Think about what that actually means for a nation-state. That is the very definition of a collapsing infrastructure. You cannot run a modern war economy on 4 hours of intermittent power. You can't run the factories needed to repair damaged tanks. You can't run hospitals effectively. You can't even keep the civilian population from freezing in the winter. It is the literal demodernization of a European state happening in real time.
But instead of seeking a diplomatic settlement, instead of trying to save what's left of the country, we are seeing dangerous escalation. We have new reports of a direct British missile strike on a Russian munitions factory.
And we need to be very, very clear about the geography here. This wasn't just a strike near the border. This was 1,000 miles deep inside sovereign Russian territory. This was a deep strike, almost certainly using Storm Shadow missiles or similar advanced tech, and it was entirely guided by Western intelligence satellites.
That is a massive, arguably unprecedented escalation. It's the UK effectively acting as an active combatant in the war.
It is. And Larry Johnson warns quite starkly that Russia is preparing to retaliate. And they aren't looking at Ukrainian targets for this retaliation. They are looking directly at British targets.
You mean retaliation against UK manufacturing facilities on British soil?
That is the fear being discussed in intelligence circles. Russia has warned repeatedly that if Western missiles hit deep inside Russia, they will hit the source of those missiles.
And this brings up the Article 5 bluff. We always hear the talking point, Article 5 means an attack on one is an attack on all. But if Russia actually strikes a factory in Manchester or Leeds in response to a British strike on a Russian factory, does NATO really go to nuclear war over that?
That is the ultimate existential question of our time. Article 5 is not an automatic tripwire. It requires a vote. It requires political consensus. If the UK provoked the retaliatory strike by hitting Russia first, does Turkey vote to nuke Moscow? Does Hungary? Does the US Congress authorize World War III to avenge a factory in Leeds?
Would the US trade New York for Leeds?
I think the Russians are betting heavily that the answer is no. They are betting that NATO is fundamentally a paper tiger when it comes to absorbing actual existential risk on behalf of an ally who escalated first.
It's deeply tragic when you look back at the diplomatic autopsy of this entire war. Jeffrey Sachs and Mercouris have been discussing this at length. The peace deal was literally on the table in 2022.
It was. In Istanbul, just weeks after the war started, the terms were relatively favorable to Ukraine compared to what they face today. It required neutrality, yes, and security guarantees, but they kept their territory mostly intact. The killing would have stopped.
But Boris Johnson flew in.
Boris Johnson, acting largely as an emissary for the U.S. and the broader Western Security Alliance, flew to Kyiv and blocked it. He told Zelensky to fight. The reported quote was effectively that they should just fight.
Because the goal wasn't actually to save Ukraine.
No. The strategic goal was to weaken Russia, to pursue Western hegemony. They believed the sanctions and the weapons shipments would bleed Russia dry on the battlefield.
And here we are, 4 years later. Let's look at the result.
Russia is militarily stronger and more battle-tested than it has been since the height of the Cold War. It is deeper into the BRICS alliance than ever before. Its economy is actually growing because it successfully pivoted its energy exports to Asia. Meanwhile, Ukraine is utterly destroyed. Europe's economy is rapidly deindustrializing because they permanently cut themselves off from cheap Russian energy. The entire operation has transitioned from a defense of sovereignty to a strategic disaster of historic proportions.
So let's pause and just look at the entire global board for a second. The U.S. is overextended in the Middle East, deeply destabilized on its southern border, and trapped in a losing proxy war in Europe. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle today, the domestic front. Because while all this chaos is happening abroad, the machinery of power right here at home is aggressively grinding its gears.
Law, money, and secrets. The three foundational pillars of the American empire are all violently shaking at once.
Let's start with the law. We have the Supreme Court ruling in Learning Resources versus Trump. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a deeply boring administrative law case, but you're telling me it's an absolute bombshell for the economy.
It is a massive, crippling blow to the administration's core economic strategy. This is a 6-3 decision that just dropped. Here's the context you need to understand. President Trump tried to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEP, to unilaterally impose sweeping global tariffs.
IEEPA, that's the post-9/11 law, right? The break glass in case of emergency statute.
Originally, yes, that was the intent. It lets the president freeze bank accounts of designated terrorists or rogue states during a crisis. But Trump tried to argue that the statutory phrase regulate importation legally gave him the absolute power to impose unlimited taxes, tariffs on anything he wanted from any country simply by declaring a national emergency.
Basically saying the trade deficit itself is a national emergency, so I'm taxing everything crossing the border.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court said absolutely not. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion. He ruled unequivocally that the power to regulate does not grant the power to impose unlimited taxes. He went straight back to the founding documents. The power of the purse, the exclusive power to tax, belongs to Congress, not the president. You cannot bypass the legislative branch just by shouting emergency.
Mark Joseph Stern had some really interesting analysis on the breakdown of this ruling. It wasn't just your standard, straight, liberal-conservative split in the reasoning.
No, it was fascinating. Legal 4D chess behind the scenes. The liberal justices, led very strategically by Kagan, concurred with the final result, meaning they agreed with stopping Trump's tariffs, but they explicitly refused to sign on to Justice Gorsuch's concurring opinion.
Why is that? if they entirely agreed on the outcome of the case?
Because Gorsuch actively wanted to use this specific case to formally establish the major questions doctrine, basically the sweeping legal idea that federal agencies and the president cannot make major economic or political decisions without incredibly specific, undeniable permission from Congress.
On the surface, that actually sounds perfectly reasonable.
It sounds reasonable to a layman, but in the legal world, it's a massive trap for the administrative state. If you apply that doctrine broadly across the government, you can systematically dismantle the EPA, the FDA, the SEC. You can strip away the power of every single federal agency to regulate anything meaningful. Kagan and the liberals clearly saw the trap. They essentially said, we agree Trump can't do this specific tariff, but we absolutely aren't going to sign your broader manifesto that destroys the entire federal government's ability to function day to day.
So what is the immediate real-world impact of this ruling?
It instantly kills the broad 10% on every one tariff plan. Trump can still technically do narrow national security tariffs, like on steel or aluminum under different statutes, but the primary economic warfare button he wanted to push, the universal global tariff to force companies back to the U.S., the Supreme Court just permanently disconnected the wiring.
And that disconnection comes at a genuinely terrible time for the U.S. dollar. Because if he can't use those massive tariffs to force favorable trade deals and generate revenue, the deficit just keeps growing unchecked.
The dollar in crisis? We really have to look at the hard numbers Sean Fu is highlighting in his analysis. The U.S. national deficit is hitting $1.9 trillion this year alone.
Just so we are clear, we are borrowing nearly $2 trillion a year to keep the lights on.
It gets much worse. It is firmly projected to hit $3.1 trillion annually by 2036. We are effectively borrowing massive amounts of money just to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed decades ago. It is a mathematical death spiral.
And the rest of the world sees this happening.
The world is already reacting. China and India are actively dumping U.S. treasuries. They are not buying our debt anymore to fund our deficits. And if you want to know what they are buying instead, just look at gold.
India imported $12 billion in physical gold in January alone. That is a massive historic number for a single month.
That is a glaring red signal. You don't aggressively buy that much physical gold unless you fundamentally distrust the future of the dollar. They are executing a coordinated exit from the dollar system. And this connects directly to what Sean Fu calls the Rubio Doctrine.
Right, Marco Rubio's recent speech in Munich.
Yes. Rubio stood up in Munich and outlined a plan to effectively divide the world. The plan is to aggressively rebuild the Western Empire, meaning the U.S. and whatever core allies decide to stick around, even if it explicitly requires debasing the currency to pay for it.
Meaning they know hyperinflation is coming.
They absolutely know it. They are already pricing it into the strategy. The ultimate choice for Washington is between saving the global empire or saving the purchasing value of the dollar, and they are choosing the empire. They will print endless money to fund the military buildup we talked about. They will spend trillions to reshore industry, and the direct result is the value of your dollar will plummet. It is a calculated, deliberate sacrifice of your daily purchasing power to maintain their geopolitical dominance.
So the entire U.S. economy is being fundamentally re-engineered for global conflict, and the currency in your pocket is the casualty.
Yeah.
But there is one more massive shadow looming over the domestic front today. We talked about law, we talked about money, now we have to talk about secrets. Because we've seen some incredible news breaking on the Epstein files recently.
This is what analysts are calling the accountability gap. And the glaring contrast between what is happening in Europe right now and what is happening here in the U.S. is stark. In Europe, heads are rolling.
We just had the former Prime Minister of Norway, Thorbjørn Jagland, formally charged with severe corruption related to his ties to Epstein.
And in the U.K., Peter Mandelson, a massive untouchable figure in British politics, essentially the primary architect of the New Labour movement, was arrested.
Arrested for official misconduct and leaking state secrets to Epstein.
That is the absolutely key phrase there. Leaking state secrets.
And meanwhile, in the U.S.,
0 arrests. Nothing. Complete and utter silence from the Justice Department.
Why the massive difference? Why are high-level foreign officials going down in flames while U.S. officials seem completely untouchable? We know for a fact there are prominent Americans all over those flight logs and files.
The analysis provided by Kim Iverson and Dimitri Lascaris is chilling. They highlight the crucial fact that these foreign officials aren't just being charged with sex crimes, they are being charged with espionage and corruption. The clear implication being made by European prosecutors is that Epstein wasn't just a vile trafficker. He was actively running a sophisticated intelligence operation.
A massive international blackmail operation.
Precisely. Obtaining highly classified state secrets to use as geopolitical leverage. Now ask yourself the logical next question. If he was running an intelligence operation of that scale, who was he running it for?
The fact that the U.S. adamantly refuses to prosecute anyone, despite the public release of the Bombay files and the damning Wexner deposition, strongly suggests that in the U.S. he was a protected intelligence asset.
That is the prevailing working theory among analysts looking at the hard data. The system inherently protects its own. In Europe, he was viewed as a foreign agent corrupting their sovereign officials, so they are arresting those compromised officials to clean house. In the U.S., he might have actually been part of the apparatus itself. Yeah. And you simply don't arrest your own apparatus.
That is a very heavy thought to hold. It suggests a deep level of institutional rot right at the core of the system.
It connects everything we've talked about today. The total impunity, the secret political leverage, the way massive foreign policy decisions are shaped behind closed doors. It explains why the bizarre decisions we see, like fueling the unwinnable war in Ukraine or pushing for a catastrophic war in the Middle East, often don't make any logical sense for the average American citizen, but make perfect strategic sense for a protected, unaccountable elite.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
If we pull the analytical thread all the way through, from the Levant to the Rio Grande to the U.S. Treasury, we see one singular, undeniable theme. The old world order is actively fracturing.
It's breaking apart at the seams.
The U.S. is aggressively attempting to enforce global control through raw military might, threatening Iran with F-35s, operating Tier 1 assets in Mexico, continually fueling the proxy war in Ukraine. It is trying desperately to use the hammer.
But the other critical levers of power are breaking.
Exactly. The economic lever is snapping in half because the world is rapidly moving to gold in the BRICS system. The legal lever is snapping because the Supreme Court is finally restricting executive overreach. And the moral lever is snapping completely because of things like the blatant Epstein cover-up and the complete diplomatic isolation over Israel's biblical territorial claims.
We are finally seeing the absolute limits of unipolar power.
We are. The U.S. can absolutely deploy carrier strike groups, but it can't stop the dollar from losing its global reserve value. It can launch a raid to kill a cartel leader, but it can't stop the nationwide chaos that immediately follows. It can threaten to bomb Iran, but it might not actually be able to defeat their new integrated radar networks.
And that leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought for you to consider this week. We talked about the fatality of assumption earlier. The arrogant assumption that U.S. tech is always superior, that U.S. intelligence is flawless.
The hugs not bullets policy failed completely in Mexico because it naively assumed the cartels would respond to kindness. But the kingpin strategy is failing just as badly because it blindly assumes overwhelming violence automatically brings order.
So the question you have to ask yourself is this. If the U.S. launches a massive strike on Iran based on flawed intelligence, based on the stubborn assumption that our stealth fighters are untouchable, what happens when the paper tiger is finally tested by a real peer-level defense system?
That is the defining question of the decade. If that assumption fails, if an F-35 is actually shot down, if a multi-billion-dollar carrier is hit by a hypersonic missile, the consequences aren't just regional, they are global. And they are permanent. The long-standing illusion of American invincibility will be shattered forever.
A very sobering place to end our deep dive today, but an incredibly important one. We need to keep our eyes wide open.
Absolutely. The fog of war is incredibly thick right now, and the only possible way through it is to look objectively at the hard data, not the wishful thinking of politicians.
If you found this analysis valuable, hit the plus or follow button on your podcast app and give us a like. Subscribe to the Hot News channel for more deep dives. Until we meet again, goodbye.